Could you both please try and define psychogeography?
John.
No, you can't.
It's your,
you can't be
your
sat here with Iain Sinclair. The one person you think can ask that question. I'll tell you what I'm going to do, Iain. I'm going to hand this. I'm going to find a point to hand it back to you. So psychogeography, as I understood it, there's two. This, in a way, is one thing. It's two things, but there is the classical definition of it, which was developed by a guy who's kind of been written out of history a little bit, isn't it? Ivan Chechkov. Or Gilles Ivan, who is a very precocious young man. But there were a group of French kind of pseudo-intellectuals who become French intellectuals who were very interested in town planning and architecture. And they thought they hated modernism and they hated the surrealists. And so they thought cities were constraining the human spirits. They put a lot of effort into coming up with an alternative vision of cities. But in a lot of ways, I think the thing that's often missed out of that version of psychogeography, and it's an important distinction to make, is they were revolutionaries. They believed in political revolution. They didn't just but part of that was this revolution of everyday life. So a lot of ways they're derives, which apparently from people that weren't one of their little group, they were kind of like, they were very short and they often involved red wine and cigarettes. But they were reconnaissance missions for a revolution that they hoped would one day come, and it very nearly did. You know, they were big. Debord was a big inspiration for the movement in May '68. When they nearly overthrew the French government. So it was part of a political programme which saw the city as the primary kind of battleground for where the revolution would take place, and of which this wandering around and making artworks and the rest of it was part of it. But they were political animals, and they operated like a political cadre. You know, the list in the Situationist International, a friend of mine's got almost the complete library of all their little texts that they were put out, and there is a document with all the members, and it's just literally date joined, date expelled. Apart from I can't remember his name now, an English guy who left, not Charles Radcliffe, who actually is the only person, I think, to resign from the Situationist International. About 1,000 people were members. All of them were expelled by Debord. But then those ideas get translated badly by Chris Gray into a book called Leaving the 20th Century. It arrives in the UK. Some hippies from Hackney, who had an interest in stone circles and earth mysteries, pick it up. Over to you, Iain. The most influential, the reason you're asking that question is probably because of what Iain did next.
Dear God. God, I should have listened to John's answer before. I get asked this quite a lot, and I'm aware of the original group as a kind of very standard French philosophical tradition. I mean, it's just like I know they despise the surrealists in some ways, but they behave exactly like them. It was like with André Breton's, instead of Guy Debord, they expel each other, as you describe. They have a kind of philosophical vision which they all disagree about, and then they go out and get drunk. And that whole thing, and it's quite interesting, everything feeds back to Hackney with me, but there's a film Orson Welles made, Around the World with Orson Welles, which has a beautiful sequence outside the Hackney Empire Theatre where he's rehearsing Moby Dick, and he comes out with cameras and he talks to these old ladies who live in almshouses at the back. And they proudly say, we're all staunch Tories here, which is great. And then it flips to Orson Welles is in Paris, and he interviews some of the lettrists who are connected with the psychogeographers. And these poets sort of read quite abstruse conceptual poems in a bookshop, and they all look incredibly bourgeois. This is that they are respectable students who are doing this sort of revolutionary thing as a form of philosophy. So I was aware of all that in the 60s to a degree, and didn't really think so much about it. And when the big meetings in the 60s, like the Dialectics of Liberation at the Roundhouse, were going on, most of the luminaries there talked a lot about psychopolitics. R.D. Laing and the anti-psychiatrists here were very engaged with this. The psycho aspect was there, as if there was something more revolutionary behind the standard tactics of politics. And it wasn't really until people like Stewart Home started to publish cod psychogeography in the Thatcher period, in which they pastiched a lot of the stuff, the classic psychogeography from Paris, and added into it elements of this other form which you'd mentioned, of the Hackney hippies, of interest in stone circles and Avebury and landscape and the kind of energy lines or whatever. Also that aspect had a social and political critique built into it. It wasn't just about sort of goofy stuff. It was about the fact that what was going on in politics was a sort of form of occult energy. So it was a big energy debate, and combining the two forms came up with a brand. And I think then subsequently it became very diminished as a concept, though the revolutionary aspect was gone. But there was a sense of wandering about cities in some vague way, taking snapshots and keeping journals was called psychogeography. And I don't think it is in any sense, either in the classic sense or as in the secondary sense, which was also revolutionary in a small way, in a different way, but equally political.
I think what you did come up with, though, is quite deeply political, actually. And I think because there's an interesting shared lineage between them, because if the Situationist International are reacting to the Surrealists whilst also being very much inspired by them, at the same time you have and the Surrealists were inspired by English Romantics, who were also interested in a lot of things that you were interested in as well. So in that there's a very direct shared lineage with the English Romantics and people like De Quincey and others, also because they were also getting mashed on opium and kind of having visions. But then also at the same time, in the 20s, you had like English topographers who were writing about the new cities, the expansion of London, for example. And they were critiquing it, but they were critiquing it I guess they were commissioned to write quite standard walking guides for the readers of Sunday papers. But within it is a critique of road building, of suburban sprawl and all the rest of it. And I think, but they're also talking about, like people like S.P.B. Mays are talking about the bucolic nature of England. They're also talking about, not earth mysteries, but the kind of topography of England. And so I do think there is a lot more. And your template was a great template for resisting the nature of modern urban change, whereas the Situationists kind of took it on head first and actually wanted to build cities. They actually thought they were coming up with plans that could be actualised. Some of them were architects. Whereas I think your vision was a lot more of a powerful tool for people to contest the vision that was being presented.
Yeah, and I think one interesting crossover here is somebody who was photographed by John Deakin as one of the key poets, young poets, was published by David Archer's Parton Press, David Gascoigne. David Gascoigne started publishing stuff in his teens, and he's one of the few of that group that I knew quite well. And he, in 1936, he became involved with the Surrealists, and he published one of the first English published primers to Surrealism. But he totally re-engaged with this second division psychogeography that was emerging, and he got in touch with me. And he started to talk about the walks that he had done in London in a sort of psychogeographical sense, in that he was trying to tap into echoes of Rambo when he was in London, and Rambo responding to the spirit of the city as a new sort of almost demonic entity of the railway stations, the trains, the energy. And it was achievable by going off on these amazing walks. And Gascoigne had gone backwards and forwards between Paris and London, translated a lot of that until he had a complete mental breakdown and sort of marched to the Élysée Palace. He marched to Buckingham Palace to say that he had the answer, and they locked him up, and he spent years in a hospital on the Isle of Wight, and then had an astonishing late life recovery. But his travels between psychogeography, surrealism, and political vision were interesting, in that the very same time that he was engaged with surrealism, he was also on Cable Street. He was on the march against when Moseley was marching into the East End. David Gascoigne was there as a witness, but as a kind of poetic witness. He was trying to read these things in terms of a poetry of the city, not just in the way that a lot of his colleagues were mass observation reporters who were trying to sort of look at the working classes as if they were under a microscope. Gascoigne didn't really do that. He gave himself up entirely to it. So he was an inspiration for me, and I think he thought of himself, strangely, as well as being an early surrealist, as being a late psychogeographer.
The Gravel Pit. Also, a really good resource is online, Houseman's Bookshop recorded the Charles Radcliffe talk. It was the first Chris Gray memorial lecture, and Charles Radcliffe was a school friend of Chris Gray, and they went to Paris together to meet the Situationists and hung out with them for a bit, and that's when Charles Radcliffe's reaction was they were really square. So he joined and then quit. And that lecture's really good. But that night I was there at Houseman's. Stewart Home was there, as was Fabian Tomset. And I went up to Stewart and he goes, meet Fabian. Fabian's the guy that actually started the London Psychogeographical Association newsletter. So Fabian went, no. Stewart can keep that one. They went, no, it's just because of Iain Sinclair. If Iain hadn't said that, no one would have said, it's not me, it's Fabian. And because in the spirit of those things, Fabian Thompson said, no, it has to be Stewart,
But I mean, how, just to turn it round, a lot of the books and the films you've done are in the spirit, understanding the original spirit and understanding the whole arc of it. Do you think psychogeography is of importance to the way that you strike out from your home base through walks through the forest or the kind of back ways of the city? Some things obviously are a kind of interrogation, others are just to do with literally being out there and walking and seeing what comes.
Yeah, less consciously now, I think now it's just whatever comes through. But I think I don't know how many years, sort of over 25 years of reading about it and studying it. I guess it does kind of happen through osmosis now rather than consciously doing it. I did projects 20 years ago where we used it as a tool to critique a development, a town centre redevelopment, and it gave us tools for public engagement as well. Because you need, when you're dealing with developers and planners, they've got their metrics. How do you respond? What can you respond with? And so psychogeography was a really useful set of tools to almost create data, which at the time was considered a very...
Does it need to be called something else? Like Nick Papadimitriou, who you've done a lot with, talks about deep topography, and that is a very different thing, even though it has elements. That in a sense, the general terminology is so threadbare, if you just throw it in, which has become a kind of shorthand for all sorts of things. And do we need to revolutionize that and go somewhere else?
Maybe. And I remember when we made London Perambulator, I think that's what you said in the interview about psychogeography, when I asked you about psychogeography, and you said, I prefer Nick's term deep topography. And I think in a lot of ways, in terms of that personal engagement with landscape and with topography, deep topography is a lot more relevant. What Nick would say, and has said quite robustly, is that Nick, he would say, if he was here, that really what he's really interested in is insect life and plant life. And, in a way, you can't practice deep topography in the way that Nick does without being obsessed with what other people call weeds. Like for him, like the unofficial countryside is almost like his seminal text, if you like. And, Nick's written extensively about ant hills. He will sit for an afternoon and study ants. Some of the things where there's crossovers where he will write about or think about or talk about, a car accident that actually happened on the A41T. But then he'll write about from the point of view of a crow who observed. I think a lot of it is about natural history.
When he did a piece for London City of Disappearances book I did, it was almost classic in both senses of deep topography and psychogeography, in that he's determined to investigate buildings from an erased village that's been lost to Heathrow Airport development, and he provokes a situation where the police arrest him, and the conflict becomes visible, the fault lines become visible, and he's done that by an action. So essentially, one kind of story becomes another, because when he's doing the first, it's very much like you say in the deep topography. He's looking at all of the natural life that's been affected, all that's surviving in these areas, and then the forces of outside that are challenging it and wiping it away. And he makes a great story out of that. And it's very similar, again, deep topography, to Alan Moore's Unearthing.
Completely. I think Alan Moore, Unearthing, and also Voice of the Fire is a great deep topography, an imagination, an imagined history for a very real location. It draws on it, but also creates this whole other set of narratives.
So I think there's two basic traditions. You've got a very politicized and philosophical French tradition, and you've got a more visionary, poetic English tradition that fuse to a degree, in that they both aim to be, to some degree, revolutionary and subversive.
Yeah. That's the answer to your question, I think, isn't it?
It's the most intelligent discussion I've had on psychogeography, because it's one of those ones that gets asked, what is it?
Yeah.
Because, it's not an easy answer. Obviously, there are places we can go now to hear the full answer.
There is a Radio 3 essay on it, actually, that Ian Marchant made. I think it was 2011. I did the interview. It would have been 2000, to the new Stratford Westfield Centre, and Stuart Holmes in it. You must be in it, Ian. I can't believe you wouldn't be in it. And in the end, I think it's Stuart Holmes or Will Self just says, it's just walking with attitude. Which is what the show is called, if you want to find it. It's called Walking with Attitude.
Yeah, I think that's what it isn't.
Yeah, exactly.
Anymore. That's what it's become.
Yeah.
What if it's walking without attitude?
Yeah, exactly.